Bing Crosby was the voice that warmed a nation, but warmth was never his truth. Control was. On Christmas Eve 1977, the man whose White Christmas had become the soundtrack to American holiday joy lay dying on a Spanish golf course, having just finished 18 holes with the same methodical precision he had brought to everything else in his life. The voice that had whispered intimately to millions through radio speakers, that had redefined what it meant to be a pop star, was about to fall silent forever. But even in his final moments, Bing Crosby remained true to the persona he had spent 60 years perfecting. Calm, controlled, and emotionally distant. The man who had taught America how to croon was taking his last breath the same way he had taken his first recording, alone despite being surrounded by people who claimed to know him. This wasn't just another story of a golden age entertainer who conquered the world with his talent. This was something more complex and disturbing. The account of a man who had created the template for modern celebrity while remaining fundamentally incapable of human intimacy, who had become the father figure for an entire nation while being unable to show affection to his own children, and who had spent decades singing about love while practicing emotional cruelty. The world knew Bing as the crooner who had revolutionized popular music, whose microphone technique had transformed singing from theatrical projection to intimate conversation, whose White Christmas had sold more copies than any song in history. But the man behind the microphone was someone entirely different, a perfectionist whose pursuit of professional excellence masked a pathological need for control, a father whose public warmth concealed private coldness, and a performer who had learned to fake emotional connection so convincingly that even he had forgotten what authentic feeling looked like. By the time a heart attack claimed him on that golf course, Bing had proven that it was possible to become beloved by millions while remaining unloved by those who knew him best. To master the art of emotional expression while remaining emotionally stunted, and to sing about dreams while systematically destroying them in the people closest to him. But to understand how someone could become America's favorite father figure while being his own children's worst nightmare, how talent could coexist with cruelty, and how a voice that brought comfort to millions could bring terror to those who heard it at home, we must return to the beginning. To a young man in Spokane who learned early that performance was power, that emotion was weakness, and that control was the only form of love he understood. The story begins not with crooning and Christmas carols, but with a question that would define Bing Crosby's entire existence. If you perfect the art of making others feel while feeling nothing yourself, are you an artist or a sociopath? May 3, 1903. Harry Lillis Crosby Jr. was born in Tacoma, Washington, into a family where Irish Catholic discipline was considered a form of love and emotional expression was viewed as dangerous self-indulgence. His father, Harry Sr., was a bookkeeper whose own frustrated ambitions had been channeled into rigid expectations for his children's behavior and achievement. His mother, Kate, was a woman whose warmth was conditional on compliance, who understood that survival in their social class required constant vigilance about appearances and reputation. From his earliest memories, the boy who would become Bing understood that his value was tied to his performance, not just his musical ability, which emerged early, but his ability to be what others needed him to be. The family's move to Spokane when he was young was part of the American pursuit of better opportunities. But it also established a pattern that would define Bing's entire life, the constant relocation of identity based on external circumstances rather than internal authenticity. The nickname Bing came from his childhood obsession with a comic strip character, but it also represented his early understanding that creating a persona could be more powerful than simply being yourself. Even as a child, he was experimenting with different versions of himself, testing which behaviors got positive responses and which ones were ignored or punished. The Catholic education he received at Gonzaga High School was both formative and traumatic, introducing him to the kind of institutional discipline that would later characterize his approach to family life and professional relationships. The Jesuit priests who taught him understood that breaking a child's will was the first step toward molding them into a proper adult, and Bing absorbed these lessons about power, control, and the necessity of suppressing emotion in service of higher goals. But Bing was also discovering that he possessed something that could make others feel what he himself seemed incapable of experiencing. A voice that could convey warmth, tenderness, and intimacy even when he felt none of those things. His early performances in school productions revealed a young man who could manipulate audiences emotionally while remaining detached from the emotions he was creating. Could this early split between performance and personality have been what enabled both his extraordinary success and his extraordinary cruelty? The development of his famous microphone technique, the innovation that would transform popular music, wasn't born from artistic inspiration but from psychological necessity. Traditional singers had to project their voices to fill large venues, which required a kind of emotional projection that Bing found exhausting and artificial. The microphone allowed him to whisper, to create intimacy without vulnerability, to simulate emotional connection while maintaining complete control over what audiences actually heard. This technological innovation was also a metaphor for Bing's entire approach to human relationships. He could make people feel close to him without actually allowing them to get close, could create the illusion of warmth while remaining fundamentally cold, and could provide comfort to others without needing to experience comfort himself. His early years performing with Paul Whiteman's orchestra were both education and apprenticeship in the business of entertainment. Whiteman was a demanding perfectionist who tolerated no mistakes and expected his musicians to subordinate their personal needs to the requirements of professional excellence. Bing learned that success required not just talent, but the ability to maintain consistent performance regardless of personal circumstances or emotional states. But he was also learning that the entertainment industry rewarded people who could deliver what audiences wanted rather than what they actually felt. The characters he played in his songs, the romantic lover, the devoted father, the loyal friend, were all performances that had little connection to his actual personality or relationships. He was becoming expert at emotional ventriloquism, making others feel things he didn't experience himself. The solo career that began in the early 1930s established Bing as something unprecedented in American entertainment. A male performer whose appeal was based on perceived sensitivity and emotional availability rather than traditional masculine traits like strength or dominance. But this public persona was carefully constructed to hide the reality of someone whose actual relationships were characterized by emotional distance and the need for absolute control. His first marriage to Dixie Lee, a talented performer in her own right, should have been a partnership between equals who understood the pressures and rewards of entertainment careers. Instead, it became a template for the psychological dynamics that would characterize all of Bing's intimate relationships. Initial charm and attention designed to secure loyalty, followed by gradual isolation and control that reduced his partner to a supporting player in his own story. Dixie's alcoholism, which would eventually kill her, was both cause and effect of her marriage to Bing. She drank to numb the pain of being married to someone who could perform love convincingly for audiences but who was incapable of providing it privately. Bing, in turn, used her drinking as justification for the emotional withdrawal and control that had been his instinctive responses to intimacy from the beginning. The pattern that emerged in their household would be repeated with devastating consistency throughout Bing's life. Public success and private dysfunction, professional warmth and personal coldness, carefully managed external image and chaotic internal reality. Their children were growing up in a home where love was conditional on obedience, where emotional expression was discouraged or punished. and where their father's affection was something to be earned rather than freely given. By the mid-1930s, Bing Crosby had achieved everything the entertainment industry promised should bring happiness. Massive record sales, successful films, a radio show that reached millions of homes, and enough wealth to ensure financial security for multiple generations. But he was also discovering that professional success only amplified the psychological problems that had driven his ambition in the first place. The question that would define the next phase of his career was whether he could use his unprecedented success to find genuine happiness and connection, or whether the very qualities that had made him famous would make authentic relationships impossible for the rest of his life. The breakthrough that made Bing Crosby a household name came with the recording of White Christmas in 1942. But the song's massive success also marked the beginning of his transformation from entertainer to American icon, a burden that would ultimately prove more destructive than liberating. Irving Berlin's composition was perfectly suited to Bing's intimate vocal style, and his recording captured something that resonated with a nation at war: the longing for home, comfort, and peace that seemed increasingly elusive in the real world. But the irony of Bing's greatest triumph was that he was singing about domestic bliss while systematically destroying it in his own home. The man whose voice became synonymous with Christmas warmth was creating an atmosphere of fear and control that would scar his children for life. The recording sessions for White Christmas took place during the same period when his oldest sons were learning to associate their father's presence with criticism, demands for perfection, and emotional punishment for any sign of weakness or failure. The success of the song transformed Bing from a popular singer into a cultural institution, but it also trapped him in an image that bore no relationship to his actual personality or values. He was expected to embody the spirit of Christmas, family togetherness, and American optimism, while privately practicing a form of emotional authoritarianism that would have been shocking to the millions of families who gathered around their radios to hear his voice. Behind all that warmth and global adoration, was there an unbearable coldness that nobody could see? The film career that developed in parallel with his recording success created additional opportunities for Bing to practice the kind of emotional performance that had become his specialty. Movies like Holiday Inn and Going My Way cast him as characters who were warm, wise, and fundamentally good-hearted, roles that he played with such conviction that audiences began to confuse the actor with the characters he portrayed. But his co-stars and directors often noticed a disturbing disconnection between Bing's on-screen warmth and his off-screen demeanor. He could deliver a touching scene about fatherly love or romantic devotion, then immediately revert to the kind of cold professionalism that made genuine connection with colleagues difficult or impossible. He was developing a reputation as someone who was perfectly pleasant to work with as long as you didn't expect actual friendship or emotional availability. The partnership with Bob Hope in the Road To series of films provided Bing with the perfect professional relationship. Entertaining collaboration that required no emotional vulnerability, and that actually benefited from the kind of competitive dynamic that Bing preferred to genuine intimacy. Their on-screen chemistry was based on mutual respect for each other's professional abilities rather than personal affection, and their off-screen relationship remained carefully bounded by the requirements of their careers. But even these surface-level professional relationships revealed aspects of Bing's personality that were troubling to those who observed them closely. He was intensely competitive in ways that seemed disproportionate to the stakes involved, needing to win at golf, card games, and even casual conversations. He had difficulty tolerating other people's mistakes or imperfections, and he could become coldly dismissive of anyone who failed to meet his exacting standards. The radio show The Kraft Music Hall that began in 1935 and continued for over a decade established Bing as the most recognizable voice in America, reaching into millions of homes every week with a carefully crafted persona of warmth, humor, and reliability. But the intimate medium of radio also required him to perfect the kind of emotional fraud that was becoming the foundation of his professional and personal life. Each week, Bing would speak directly to his audience about family, values, and the simple pleasures of American life, creating the illusion of a personal relationship with listeners who felt they knew him intimately. But the man who spoke so convincingly about the importance of family relationships was practicing a form of parenting that emphasized obedience over affection, performance over authenticity, and fear over love. The contrast between his public and private selves was becoming so extreme that even Bing seemed sometimes to lose track of which version was real. He would give interviews about the joys of fatherhood while using methods of discipline that bordered on psychological abuse. He would sing songs about romantic love while treating his wife with a coldness that contributed to her alcoholism and early death. Did this tragic event mark his downfall? Or was it simply the tipping point that revealed the depth of his long-hidden pathologies? The death of Dixie Lee in 1952 from complications related to her alcoholism should have been a moment of reflection and possible change for Bing, but instead it became an opportunity for him to further perfect his public image while maintaining the emotional distance that had characterized their marriage. He played the role of the grieving widower with the same professional competence he brought to his other performances, but those who knew him well noticed that he seemed more concerned with managing the public relations aspects of his loss than with processing any genuine grief. The impact on his children was devastating and revealing. They had lost the only parent who had shown them any real affection, however compromised by alcohol, and were now completely dependent on a father who viewed parenting as an exercise in control rather than nurturing. Bing's response to their grief was to impose even stricter discipline and higher expectations, as if emotional pain could be cured through improved performance and absolute obedience. His second marriage to Katharine Grant in 1957 was presented to the public as a romantic new beginning, but it actually represented Bing's perfection of the techniques he had developed during his first marriage. Katharine was young, beautiful, and career-focused, but she was also someone who could be molded to fit Bing's requirements for a wife, rather than someone who might challenge his need for control. The relationship dynamics that emerged were familiar but more sophisticated. Bing provided financial security and social status in exchange for complete compliance with his expectations about behavior, appearance, and public presentation. Katharine learned to be the perfect entertainment industry wife, supporting Bing's career while suppressing any aspects of her own personality that might compete with his need to be the center of attention. But the second set of children from this marriage would grow up in a household that was even more rigidly controlled than the one that had shaped Bing's older sons. He had refined his parenting techniques over the years, becoming more subtle but also more effective at suppressing any signs of independence or emotional authenticity in his children. The success of White Christmas as both a song and a movie had created expectations that Bing would continue to embody the spirit of family togetherness and holiday warmth for the rest of his career. Christmas specials, holiday albums, and seasonal appearances became annual obligations that required him to perform joy and familial love while privately practicing emotional authoritarianism. The psychological toll of maintaining this contradiction for decades was evident to those who worked closely with Bing during this period. He was developing the kind of rigid control over his own emotions that made spontaneity or authentic feeling nearly impossible. He had become so practiced at performing warmth that he seemed to have forgotten how to actually experience it. The drinking that had begun as social lubrication gradually became a necessity for managing the stress of maintaining multiple contradictory identities. Alcohol allowed Bing to relax the control he exercised over himself and others, but it also made him more likely to reveal the coldness and cruelty that his public persona was designed to hide. By the 1960s, Bing was beginning to understand that his greatest professional achievement, becoming America's favorite father figure, had also become his greatest personal limitation. He was trapped within an image that required him to be emotionally available to millions of strangers while remaining emotionally absent from the people who actually shared his life. Can anyone ever truly escape from the shadow of their darkest moments? Or do some people simply learn to sing those shadows into something that sounds like light? The 1960s brought challenges that tested every aspect of Bing's carefully constructed public image. His older sons were reaching adulthood and beginning to speak more openly about their childhood experiences, though they were still too dependent on his financial support and too conditioned by years of emotional manipulation to openly rebel. The music industry was changing in ways that made his style seem outdated and irrelevant to younger audiences, and he was forced to confront the possibility that his cultural influence was waning. But perhaps most troubling was the growing recognition among entertainment industry insiders that Bing's personal behavior was inconsistent with his public image in ways that could be damaging if they became widely known. Stories about his harsh treatment of his children, his emotional coldness toward his wives, and his vindictive responses to anyone who crossed him were beginning to circulate among people who had worked with him over the years. The decision to continue performing and recording despite these challenges was both practical and psychological. Bing needed the income to maintain his lifestyle and financial obligations, but he also needed the validation and control that came from public performance. The stage and recording studio were the only places where he could experience something approximating emotional connection, even though that connection was entirely one-sided and based on illusion. The television specials that became a staple of his later career were exercises in nostalgia that allowed Bing to replay his greatest hits while avoiding the more challenging aspects of contemporary music and culture. These shows reinforced his image as a timeless entertainer whose appeal transcended generational differences, but they also highlighted how disconnected he had become from the emotional authenticity that had originally made his performances compelling. The guest appearances by his children on these specials were particularly disturbing to those who understood the family dynamics involved. Bing would present his sons and daughters as evidence of his success as a father, but their performances revealed young people who had been trained to perform affection and gratitude rather than actually feel those emotions. The golf obsession that consumed much of Bing's later life was both escape and metaphor for his approach to human relationships. Golf was a game that rewarded precision, control, and emotional distance, qualities that Bing had cultivated throughout his life. It was also a solitary sport that could be played in the company of others without requiring genuine intimacy or emotional vulnerability. The Bing Crosby Pro-Am tournament that he established became one of the most prestigious events in professional golf. But it also revealed his need to control every aspect of his environment and his relationships. The tournament was run with the same authoritarian precision that characterized his household, and participants learned that Bing's hospitality came with expectations about behavior and gratitude that were not negotiable. Were these final decisions acts of artistic integrity, or desperate attempts to maintain control over a legacy that was beginning to crumble? The health problems that began to affect Bing in the 1970s were partly the result of decades of emotional stress and the physical toll of maintaining impossible standards for himself and others. The heart condition that would eventually kill him was exacerbated by his refusal to acknowledge vulnerability or seek help for problems that he viewed as signs of weakness. But even in illness, Bing maintained the emotional distance that had characterized his entire life. He approached his health challenges with the same methodical precision he brought to his professional work, following doctor's orders and maintaining his public appearances while refusing to engage with the emotional implications of mortality or the possibility of reconciliation with those he had hurt. The final performance, just days before his death on that Spanish golf course, was vintage Bing Crosby, professionally competent, emotionally distant, and perfectly controlled. He delivered his songs with the same technical excellence he had maintained for over 40 years. But those who were present noticed that there was something hollow about the performance, as if he was going through motions that no longer had any personal meaning. The conversations he had with friends and family during his final weeks revealed a man who was more concerned with managing his legacy than with making peace with his past. He was still focused on controlling how he would be remembered rather than acknowledging the pain he had caused or seeking forgiveness from those who had been damaged by his need for dominance. On October 14, 1977, Bing Crosby collapsed and died on the 18th hole of a golf course near Madrid, having just completed a round that he had played with his characteristic attention to detail and emotional control. He was 74 years old, a man who had spent 7 decades perfecting the art of emotional performance while remaining fundamentally incapable of authentic feeling. The death was sudden but somehow inevitable, the final act of someone who had spent his entire life avoiding vulnerability and authentic connection. He died as he had lived, surrounded by people but fundamentally alone, admired by millions but truly known by no one. October 14th, 1977. The date marked not just the death of Bing Crosby, but the end of an era when it was possible for entertainers to maintain complete separation between their public personas and their private realities. The man who died that day had been both the most beloved voice in America and one of its most emotionally damaged father figures, proving that talent and cruelty could coexist in the same person without either canceling out the other. The immediate response to his death revealed the complete success of his lifelong project to control his public image. Obituaries focused on his musical innovations, his film career, and his role in defining American popular culture, while barely mentioning the personal relationships that had been casualties of his success. The tributes emphasized his warmth, his talent, and his contribution to the entertainment industry, creating a narrative that bore little resemblance to the experiences of those who had actually lived with him. The funeral was attended by some of the biggest names in entertainment, politics, and sports, all of whom spoke about Bing's generosity, his professionalism, and his fundamental decency. But those who knew him most intimately, his children, his wives, his closest collaborators, were notably subdued in their public comments, offering polite tributes that carefully avoided any reference to his actual personality or parenting style. But the most telling aspect of the immediate aftermath was how quickly the entertainment industry moved. To protect Bing's legacy from any information that might complicate the narrative of his essential goodness, stories about his harsh treatment of his family were dismissed as exaggerations or misunderstandings, and anyone who might have provided a more complex picture of his character was discouraged from speaking publicly. Was his death as straightforward as reported, or were powerful hidden forces involved? In Bing's case, the hidden forces were cultural, an entertainment industry that had invested too much in his image to allow it to be tarnished, a society that needed its father figures to be genuinely paternal, and a family that had been conditioned by decades of emotional manipulation to protect their abuser even after his death. The estate he left behind was vast and complex, reflecting both his financial success and his obsessive need to control every aspect of his life and legacy. The wealth was distributed according to detailed instructions that continued his pattern of using money to manipulate behavior, with inheritances tied to conditions about conduct, career choices, and public statements about their father. But the most significant aspect of his legacy was the template he had created for modern celebrity. The ability to maintain a public persona that was completely divorced from private reality, the use of media manipulation to control public perception, and the transformation of personal pathology into entertainment industry success. The entertainment industry's response to his death included the establishment of awards and foundations in his name, all of which celebrated his professional achievements while carefully avoiding any examination of the personal costs of those achievements. Bing had successfully ensured that his legacy would be defined by his music rather than his behavior, his contributions rather than his casualties. In the years immediately following his death, the official narrative of Bing Crosby's life remained largely unchallenged. But the silence couldn't last forever. In 1983, Gary Crosby published Going My Own Way, a devastating memoir that detailed the physical and emotional abuse he and his brothers had suffered at their father's hands. The book shattered the careful image management that had protected Bing's legacy for decades. The publication created a cultural earthquake that rippled through everything Bing had built. His revolution of popular music through microphone technique, transforming singing from theatrical projection to intimate conversation, suddenly seemed less like innovation and more like manipulation. The blueprint he had created for modern celebrity management, the complete separation of public persona from private reality, was exposed as a template for concealing systematic cruelty. The entertainment industry that had protected his image for so long was forced to confront uncomfortable questions they had spent decades avoiding. When does protecting a legacy become complicity with abuse? How do we separate the art from the artist when the artist's cruelty is documented by his own children? Every manufactured father figure who had followed Bing's playbook was suddenly suspect. Every intimate vocal performance questioned for its authenticity. But perhaps the most profound impact was how the revelations forced listeners to hear his voice differently. The warm whisper that had comforted millions now sounded like evidence of someone who could fake human feeling with terrifying precision. The man who had taught America how to be intimate through technology had been incapable of intimacy in life. The ultimate question that Bing's life raised, whether artistic genius justified personal cruelty, or whether society's need for father figures blinded them to actual fathering failures, remained unresolved but could no longer be ignored. Bing Crosby had been the voice that warmed a nation, but more tragically, he had been proof that the ability to simulate human warmth was not the same as the capacity to feel it. He had revolutionized popular music by perfecting the art of intimate communication while remaining fundamentally incapable of intimacy, had become America's father figure while being a failure as an actual father. When the music stops, the silence finally sings the truth.